more procedurally. For example, if you're a general practitioner and you have a milling machine in your practice, you prepare the tooth, you scan it intraorally, you fabricate it around, and you place it that day. That's combined treatment. But we're not talking about traditional combination. We're not talking about traditional synergy. Today, combined treatment includes the synergistic effects of combining treatment therapies. And what is the took this directly from the dictionary. The cooperation to produce a combined effect greater than the sum of separate effects. So instead of 1 equals 2, 1 equals 5. The combined treatment steps, it also involves the shaping of the biologic response. When we shape the biologic response, we end up with a synergistic effect that's perhaps different from what we expected. Procedures, enhancing our outcomes by combining new biomaterials. Might be a bioactive or an osteoinductive implant, so the tissue matures, changing the way mineralization occurs. Combine things so that we spend less time in treatment and get a mature. It's critical, for example, for extraction immediate implant placement, because we're doing not only immediate implant placement, sometimes we're doing immediate provisionalization, sometimes we're doing immediate load. And we don't want early failures. So if we look at it, we start to use things because we know the science and biology behind them. Sometimes when we combine them with another biomaterial, in this case is the osseous surface. And the osseous surface is a molecular impregnated. Are there any endodontists in the audience, by the way? I don't mean to offend anybody, but today we call it pre-implant therapy, because it preserves the extract this, but we're not going to place a bone. F. Differ with that because at the thickness of this tissue, look at it 100% bottle, 70% vascularity inside the osteotomies. Surface. There are papers that are written, and very few papers, however, have ever been written using human studies. Most of them are animal studies. This is one of the few that are in vivo, done by a friend of mine, Adriano Piatelli, who's the editor-in-chief of the European Journal of the Academy of Osteointegration. And what they did was, in Italy, they took a group of patients, placed a number of implants, with the provision that 2 of the implants were going to be extracted after 2 months and examined histologically. And the only difference was they were identical implants. One just had acid etched, one was acid etched plus the calcium phosphate surface, the osseous surface. And if we look at the implant at 2 months, we see an average percentage of vital bone. No different from any other implant that you're going to see histologically. If we look at it in magnification, what we also see is not very much bone remodeling at 2 months. It's in a steady state already. And not much cellular, just a fair number of osteocytes as the bone is not very impressive. But in the contralateral side, the implant looks very, very different. In this case, look at the amount of bone, look at the density of bone, and we what's taking place between the threads here. Not only is there good bone remodeling, bone here. Look at the number of osteocytes here. Look at the maturity in the same length of time, 2 months. And if we put those two implants side by side, same patient, two implants that have this calcium phosphate surface, look at the difference in fibrin attachment between the two implants. So already from day one, from the moment we're placing our implants, we have a qualitative difference in just the attachment of fibrin. If we have a better attachment of fibrin, we're going to get more mineralization, more cells being attracted to the surface, and get a bone maturation more quickly. And this complex attachment then, the synergy of the surface plus the calcium phosphate. And it in fact is. And now we're going to explain why that occurs. What just happened here? Just roll right through my presentation. Don't you love technology? Wait. Example, this was done and we put a floating implant. How many of you would dare to place an implant with 0% of bone to implant contact? In fact, the bone and the implant is just floating around inside. Not many people would do that. But sometimes we get that. We're placing an implant and we get a spinner engage in the bone and it starts to spin around. Or sometimes we'll microfracture a piece of bone and we'll get a floater. Okay. And then what the study was to play a dog model where the osteotomy size was larger than the implant body. And then they tried all combinations. They tried implants without a surface, just acid etched, and no biologics, no BRF. And they looked at it histologically. So here is the result, calcium phosphate, and without leukocyte-containing platelet-rich fibrin. And what we have here is a soft tissue, not bone. Bone did not grow to that implant. That's not a good sign. The next group was without the osseous surface, but with PRF. And the result was they have a little bit of bone that adapts to the implant surface, but not distant from the implant surface. Still a soft tissue. The third group was without PRF. Now we're starting to see something a little bit different, a little bit more bone growing distant from the implant body, but not very far past that. Still a soft tissue seam. And the last group, the fourth group, had both the osseous surface plus the LPRF. And now we see something dramatic. Not only do we have bone that grows from the implant body, but the bone grew all the way across the defect with no interposing soft tissue. That is the synergistic effect. The combination of the two gave us a completely different outcome. Now you say, all right, Robert, that's fine. That's in sort of an in vivo dog model study. How does that translate to the human model? Can we use this information clinically? And Dr. Giorno, the CEO of Ventrolog, who I worked for many, many years, I would say to him, that's fine. I need to use this clinically. I need to prove the paradigm to myself. And I had the perfect case to do this. 5mm implant, an interlock implant. I've seen the deal for us, other thing and the take the middle lip that stick in just finger push this out of the osteum. implant, these places, so what we do is we're going to push it down below the tissue level. If we enlarge this for a moment, you're going to see something quite dramatic. The density of the bone where there was a gap is actually better than the bone that is distant from the implant, which means that the combination of the LPRF and the release of calcium from that calcium phosphate surface had a synergy and enabled me to get what was essentially a failed implant that was then loaded and put back into function. Thank you. Pressing the one on the right. Next slide.
phrase, but what's important is the platelets that are, the concentration of platelets that you'll see here, and they are a good source of proteins. Can you plug this in up here so I can push this?
Hello? Okay, so sorry for the technical difficulties here. My phone's not working either. Hello? Okay, so I'm going to present from here due to the slight difficulties, so I apologize for not seeing me up there. So, to get back onto it, so tissue regeneration. So tissue regeneration has been around for some time. It's not only important in the medical field, but as well has been garnering a lot more attention in the dental field as well, more and more. And as you saw over the last couple of days with Dr. Miller, or just in this presentation, with placing the implants and where there's bone missing, it's important to regain that structure so you can place that implant. So with this LPRF and then the concentrations of the different platelets, we've known that these are going to be a good source of growth factors, and their counterparts in there, we have the potential to provide and enhance the bone regeneration process. So these growth factors, what's great about them? They are, first of all, they're important because they're natural. They're coming from the source that they're being harvested when we're harvesting this PRF. So having this autologous source does minimize the risk for rejection. I like to use the word minimize because there's always that 0.1% or 0.05%. So if I use it eliminates it, you'll come back to see me one day, and then you'll be like, well, Lucas, you were wrong. They do. These factors do allow for the stimulation and proliferation, which is important in the healing process. Some of these growth factors you'll commonly see or hear of are protein or steroid hormones. And as I said, they're in this regulation process. So some of the ones that are sourced, just an example that we've heard of or you've read in the literature, here's just a summary of them and what they're really good for or what they're focused on, especially. So as the presentation did indicate is how are we going to harvest PRF, or more specifically this LPRF, in an effort to enhance bone regeneration, more specifically in critical size defects. So this is a brief timeline in general of just PRF, where it started and when it started, and dating back into the early or mid to late 1990s. And today I'm going to show you more along the lines where we are and where we're going. People in the field did publish a review. There is contraindications between different papers and different methods, but I'm going to show you what our group and our team has been working on and how we've used a systemic approach really to compare and contrast what's available and what we're working with. So just to reiterate, the PRF is a bioscaffold, which, as I said, we're harvesting it. Dr. Miller also said that we're harvesting it as well. It's produced without the need for these anticoagulants. It's proven to be a reservoir for these growth factors, as I mentioned, to be either for this guided tissue regeneration or in some cases for guided bone regeneration. So the PRF of these growth factors over a period of time. So there are some within 3 days, some within 7 days, so we'll get into that in a little bit. Has the ability to within its network. And again, this is where we're incorporating these leukocytes, which is also important. So all of this is also important to the immune cells, and it's going to be able to direct these cells into the pathway that we need. On the timeline, there was different types of PRF available over time as we adapted and evolved, and these PRF are harvested using different protocols. But really what we're here to focus on is the LPRF protocol from the intraspin that we've been using for this guided bone regeneration. So it's a combination. The LPRF is a vibrant scaffold, the enmeshment of the leukocytes, which are cytokines, the healing process. We also know that the neutrophils and the macrophages have that capacity to minimize the potential for infection. Compared to the other platelet-rich fibrins that we have, LPRF has been reported to release higher levels, period. So aside from what most of us in the literature have seen, these do have a crucial role in the guided bone regeneration, what I'm going to show you. In dentistry, as all of us here are dentists or in the field, these are the places that we can use the LPRF, the applications, whether it's periodontal surgery, alveolar preservation, soft and hard tissue regenerations, and gap management, which is something important. One thing that does stick out to me was that while LPRF has been used in many surgical procedures due to its excellent properties, there is a limited amount of clinical studies. There's a lot of clinical studies shown, but when it comes to the preclinical work, how this may work, that's where we're lacking, and this is what I'm here to really show you. Therefore, our series of studies, preclinical, using animal models, whether it was either a sheep or a canine model, and we were able to evaluate these over a series of time periods. Research that's happening behind the scenes that's able to lay the groundwork moving forward. So our group performed 3 studies. In the first study, we wanted to evaluate the effect of the LPRF that's harvested. In the second study, it should be really study 1A instead of study 2. We used those LPRFs combined with and we evaluated that after 6 weeks. Last study in the sheep that we did, also a submandibular defect with PLGA as well, and we evaluated as a function of time using one of the centrifugation speeds. In the canine studies, it's also similar, something to what Dr. Miller showed with the extraction sockets. Here we're also going to show it though with using BioOS, so using a bone grafting material at 6 weeks. And the last study using the LPRF for gap management around implants, also in a dog model. So as I said, the first study using this different speeds and what is the effect of the force on LPRF. So in this study, we went to 3 different spinning speeds, low, intermediary, and high, and you see right above the instrument machine what speeds we were using. We were collecting 9 millimeters or 9 cc's of blood from each animal and then subjected to these spinning. We removed the clot, as you see here on the right-hand side, and we set at the bottom of the tube for CBC analysis. It's important to note that we also did do 2 really won't compare what we're getting between the 2. So something that was not really available and most recently what the baseline is, what we're starting without any centrifugation forces on our blood. Afterwards, after the 3 different speeds and which speed is going to be the in terms of the results. So here just highlighting a few of the differences at the top when comparing the 3 different speeds. But when we first start looking into these results, here on the left you see exactly what this tube 12 minutes at 200, 400, and 600 respectively. And it's not until the right-hand side where you start seeing the weights of the LPRF clot that you see that 600 RCF yielded the highest and statistically significant compared to the lower 200. There was no statistical differences when we compared between 200 and 400. So that suggested that we were producing a denser fiber matrix in terms of spinning speed. So that built a story to where we actually ended up using these LPRF plots in vivo in the animal model using PLGA as our carrier. So here you see the clots that were separated from the red blood clot at the tube. We ended up taking these. We identified the submandibular aspect of the mandible. We used some 3D printing to create as perfect as you can imagine. I'm not a surgeon. One monocortical. We ended up with 4 of those. Here from left to right, where our control was our PLGA, and then moving the second from your left was the 200, 400, and 600. Then we set these animals out to live, and when we harvesting is this seeing the results. So on the which is the micro construction, which is the best results because we end up seeing a volume. Did close in, and when we move over, we are getting more bone filling in. When we evaluated these volumes of bone regeneration, once again, the 600 RCF yielded the highest results with the most bone regeneration, but both outperformed the 200 RCF. So these higher RCF yielded larger, not only larger membranes, but also more bone regeneration with the PLGA. Which is in terms of evaluating the quality of bone. You see up top, we saw most of the bone kind of grow in from the peripheral of the defect. It's not until you, the middle image and more so the bottom image, and then when we really look at the higher magnification, we can see that the 600 yielded our application on every LPRF out of using the 600 RCF speed in terms of regenerative defect. So then we took it one step further because that was just one time point we were looking at. And now we wanted to use the same LPRF in combination again with the PLGA scaffold using what's considered this large translational model, the sheep. But now we wanted to compare it at 2 different healing times. We saw just earlier in the earlier slides, here you see 3 weeks, and at the bottom you see 6 weeks. From left to right you see a negative control now, so it's not really filled in is what we expected. Then in the middle aspects of your screen, you start seeing the PLGA, and then at the last part you see the PLGA with the LPRF. So when you look at these pictures, you can see that you may seem like there's a 3 weeks between the control and the experimental groups. Now you see that the experimental group, the PLGA, and the and they are a lot statistically significant compared to the results. Studies in the first one, the relative centrifugation force, the larger PRF plots, membranes. When we went to the in vivo model using the study 1, the 600 did also yield a which we saw that both on histological analysis as well as volumetric analysis. And that's similarly with the regeneration at 3 and 10 weeks using So those are for bony regeneration with no dental implants. Now how about we take a look at LPRF in the extraction sockets and as well as LPRF for gap management. So for this study, we wanted to evaluate the effects of LPRF with and without the combination of this potential use for bone ridge preservation. We chose a bilateral extraction of the first molars. It was a split mount design to give us a higher statistical power being able to compare this to the same animal. So the 4 groups we identified, we wanted to evaluate an empty socket, so to evaluate what would be the spontaneous healing aspect, so no PRF, no bone graft. Then we had a group that was just filled, a socket that was just filled with biomass, the grafting with after some time, from the left to right, the same groups are provided here. You see some bone regeneration, not much. With the biomass, you do see a little bit more, but the biomass is still used in there. Still remnants. That's something we all are aware of, the half-life or the resorption rates of biomass. Then LPRF with the biomass. See any differences at the groups, but everything compared to the whether we're using, but that's not our analysis. We want to see if there was a difference. So when we compared the groups that had no LPRF compared to the groups that had LPRF, there was identify where we're seeing these. We took it to evaluating the amount in terms of the horizontal distance, the vertical distance, and we measured it, those yellow lines that you see faintly. We were measuring gap management, so there was no differences. And then when we started looking at the vertical, we saw with the LRF was able to maintain. And of course, the last group, as we expected, there was a lot of empty space left, a void left. Biomass was able to maintain that space. Tissue infiltration or from top. We also saw results both in the horizontal and in the vertical aspects using the RF with the biomass. So 6 weeks. So the last study was to use the LPRF for gap management, and that's something that is important is when you have these extractions and you potentially want to do the immediate placement of implants. So here we wanted to use the LPRF with an implant. We chose 3 time points, 3, 6, and 12 weeks. We had 2 different types of osteotomies in the radius of the canine. We had, I guess the second from the left is kind of your conventional, and the far left, or the 2 larger ones, are what would be kind of to mimic immediate extraction of the tooth and what we potentially would place in. Is a 6 millimeter trephine defect was placed in. As well. We locked it in at the bottom aspect, at the coronal aspect, and then we ended up putting somebody with an LPRF membrane around it. You have a wide osteotomy gap mat with no PRF, and the last one we have the wide osteotomy with the LPRF. And this is see how that would facilitate this bone regeneration. Here's a histological slide at 3 weeks. When we look at this at 3 weeks, you see narrow autonomy because we had a high primary stability. At 6 weeks in a dog, this is relatively faster than the model, so we're starting to see. And then when we look at the last group at 12 weeks, really a bone turnover at this point. So the only statistical differences were in the batho in the wide osteotomies, which is what was expected because of the low primary stability. So as you can see on the left here, bone to implant contact, the group with the PRF did provide statistically higher value compared to the group without a PRF. And similarly, as well, we had a statistically significant difference in higher bone area fraction occupancy within the thread. Look at the time points of the 3 weeks where it's in the clinics. That's also going to be important to be able to have that stability or gap management. Are telling in itself. What was really interesting to note was that when you look at without LPRF, you see the soft tissue. So that's important that you want to prevent that soft tissue infiltration. So when the canine model, the conclusions that we had were utilized alone did augment it to levels comparable with the xenograft. So it suggested that we can use the LPRF as a material for socket preservation. In the how the LPRF was used for the management of the gaps and the wide osteotomies, as I just showed, it did have a formation, but more importantly, it did prevent the healing process. So a few things to consider when you're using LPRF in the dental field for bony regeneration. So there are different anatomical. These are a complex issue to be able to solve this. The literature that is available out there is limited in certain cases, but at times also controversial. So it's very important to read into the literature and see how it's used, the benefits and disadvantages. It's very important that the bony regeneration that we are achieving is the quality and the quantity. It's not always just getting a large amount of bone, because that bone can have poor quality. So as you can see, what we've been able to show here in preclinical models, the utilized tissue engineering materials. So you have these growth factors that are being released. It's able to deliver these autologous cells. It's being harvested from the patient. One thing to consider is that the LPRF is considered as an active living tissue. So for natural guided tissue regeneration, it's not simply just a growth.
Let's welcome together Dr. John.
My goal, I was a clinician before. I was always interested into fundamental science, into hard science, because I believe it's the only way to understand the underlying. So I started different topics, and I always have been interested in the larger system area. So, because in implant dentistry today, when you look at the different brands and all the hypes, there is a lot of marketing. And this is not, you're not buying a perfume, you're buying a medical device, and it's supposed to function and work efficiently. So, I keep losing connectivity for some reason, but that's fine, we will manage. So, there is a lot of data that can be systematically measured. There are some ISO that way we can measure benchmarks. It's not connecting over the Wi-Fi, so can I ask you to move to next slide? Let's see. Now it's working. So also integration, when we look at the definition of it, doesn't give you a clear idea of what's going on. So because integration, if you look at the definition from Bradmark, in the early 80s, is just looking at the but life doesn't start and end at the optical microscopic level. This is at the microscopic level, but phenomena occur at the nanometric level and even at the molecular level. You think this will work? Okay. The left. So that's what I've been trying to. No, this. Okay. So when you look at all the clinical reports that you see in the literature, you always have good numbers, but you cannot compare the studies because they don't always use the same parameters. Can you move to the next slide? Move forward. Okay, this is fine. Can you move forward? One? It's going to be easier. I'm going to ask you to move forward. No, you are going backwards now. One more. That's what I was saying before. It's not only at the micrometer level. There are a lot of interplays with the macro geometry, the thread design, and the nano geometry, and going to the molecular interference. Next one. So, if you look at implant surfaces at about 1,000, 3,000 times magnification, they all look different, but it's just artistically different. But from an engineering point of view, they are about the same. They have about the same RA, the same RQ. Next slide. Next slide again. Okay. So, a long time ago, I don't even remember the year, but probably in 2004, 2005, we published this study to compare 14 dental implant surfaces. Next slide. We designed this kind of technical ID card for each implant, where on the upper left you see the chemical composition of the implant surface. This is done with the XPS SCA spectrometry, and you can see the compositions. So this is like the T-Unite from Nobel implants. So you see the composition. What you need to look at is the carbon content, 22%, and all the components that you don't want to see, like phosphorus. You have about 7% of phosphorus. This is a leftover from the phosphoric acid that is used in the process. On the upper right, this is the Auger spectroscopy. So this is a very, very precise oxide layer. So you go from the surface to 1,000 down into the surface. This is scanning electronic microscopy, 5,000 times magnification, and then what is very enlarge this to 100,000 times. What you will see is basically it becomes smooth as a mirror. There is no more profilometry. Next slide. This is the ozone surface that the previous speakers were talking about. What is so different? If you look at the composition, you see that it's very low, 18%. This is basically the carbon from the air, from the CO2 that we breathe. It means there is no organic contamination on this implant. And what do you see? You see a composition of phosphorus and calcium. Actually, on the Auger spectroscopy, it will show you that this is calcium phosphate. But if you look at the Auger, you will see that the calcium phosphate is not in the form of particles. Why? If you look at the scanning electronic microscopy at very high magnification, 100 times magnification, you remember the Nobel surface. At 100,000 times magnification, it was flat, totally smooth as a mirror. Look at the geometry here at the same magnification. You have a nano roughness. And this is key because the biological effect that Dr. Miller was talking about, he attributed it mostly to the calcium phosphate. But most of the biological effect is due to the... Actually, on the market today, there is no other implant with a nano roughness. And by doing that, fibrinogen, before it polymerizes into fiber, directly, just like a Velcro kind of thing. Or today, because of the, we hear so much about the spikes of the COVID and the vaccine, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, what do? They induce the body to manufacture protein that will look like the spikes. So our body will be trained to, when we are confronted to the real virus, our body will say, oh, I remember those spikes, I know how to block them, and it will block it. It's just like a, basically it's basic immunological response, which is like 3D parts fitting into each other. So that's what's happening with the ocean surface. This nano roughness will offer the fibrinogen to really bind to this surface, and when it polymerizes into fibrin, you will have very high adhesion of the fibrin to the surface. And this explains how those implants were salvaged. These lost implants, it was placed back into the socket with fibrin, and it ultimately integrated. Next slide. And what is interesting on this surface is the fractal surface, which means this picture that I show you at 100,000 times magnification, if I show you magnification, it will look almost identical. It's like Russian dolls. The big one, you open one, there is the same one smaller inside. You open the second one, there is a smaller inside, etc., etc. At the molecular level. And this is a fractal model. So we didn't do anything mimic nature. We have to be very humble because we don't invent anything. We look around, we look at the nature, we don't always, but we know that it works. So if we can copy a little bit what nature knows how to do, we will have something successful. And now it's, this surface had been round, and we had nothing but great success with this surface. Of course, clearly, because if you have dirt or organic contents, oil onto the surface, he will not know how to deal with this and will lose his resources and energy in order to clean it. So if you provide an implant which is clean, what I'm saying seems obvious, but believe me, it's not obvious. If you read this paper about the comparison of those implant surfaces, you will be surprised to see how many implants are not so clean, but they are on the market. And the optimal profilometry is at every level, because when you look at the micro level, the micro level will interact physically with the bone when it's mature. So it has its function. Next slide. It's a very paper that has been written also in collaboration with the NYU team and Albrechtsen from Göteborg and Dohan in Paris. And I like to cite this paper because it was published in a very high impact factor journal. Trends in Biotechnology is a very high impact factor journal, which make it valuable science if you looked at any science combined. So basically they were comparing, next slide, the T-unite surface, which they say those are surfaces from the past, to surface, and they say this is the surface of the future for all the reasons that I have cited before. Next slide. This is the first paper that was published about the ozone surface. You know, when I was talking about marketing before, you also have marketing in science. You know, for example, when we published this first paper, we were not allowed to call the surface by its name because it was totally unknown, and the editors look at that like, you know, you are going to do marketing. So we had to call it a weird name, dual, we called it bioceramic grid blasted acid etch. Which is technically what this is. So what you see here, we compare on the right, we have the old surface, which is just the blasted and acid etch surface, and on the left you have the ozone surface. So on this atomic force microscopy, what you can see is that this surface has much more detail. Next slide. And the study was very straightforward. It was on the beagle dogs, and they were extraction sites that were healed, and implants were placed, identical shape implants. The only difference was the surface. Half of the implants, they were the old surface, and half of the implant the surface. And two things have been performed. The removal torque, how much torque it takes to remove the implant, and then the histomorphometry. What you can see is that on the old surface, after 2 weeks, it took about 120 Newton centimeters to remove the implant. With the ozone surface, you double that to 201 Newton centimeters. And this is the only variable that has changed. Changing the surface requires twice the amount of torque to remove the implants. So we knew that this surface was very interesting. Next slide. So we know today that this is because of the nanometer scale profilometry. Next slide. This is the paper Dr. Miller was referring to, so I will not repeat everything he said, but one thing that I want to point out was the higher density of osteocyte around this surface. What does that mean? So at that point, I sat down with my good friend, Paulo Coelho from NYU, and I told him, you know what, my intuition is telling me that there is something on the surface that is affecting the genetic outcome of the cell differentiation. So let's try to put a study together. Now we need to go put that back in perspective, because this is like 15 years ago. At that time, there were very few animals with the genome already published, and it was very difficult to do these kind of things. Today it's so easy. So we took the rat model, because it was one of the few animals with the genome published, and we put a study together. It took 5 years to complete the study. Next slide. And it was published in Bone in 2014. So it means, yes, we started in 2008 to 2009, this study. And basically, we were looking at the gene expression of a few proteins. The proteins on the left, they are specific to the bone formations. They are collagenase, osterix, and osteonectin. And on the right, there are proteins that are specific to the bone maturation, mineralization. Runex, osteopontin, and alkaline phosphatase. And if you look at the ocean, you can see the peak of gene expression, which is so much higher for the ocean surface. So bingo, the hypothesis was confirmed. The surface alone favorizes the bone formation and bone maturation, which is big news because, basically it looks like the implant is not only osteoconductive, but it could be also inductive, which is huge. Next slide. This is the study, you have seen before, so I won't go back to that, but it shows clearly the benefit of the synergy between the ocean surface and the PRF. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide again. So this is a comparative study also from the NYU group, comparing different implants, Astra OsteoSpeed, Straumann SLA, Intralock Ocean, and the Nobel Activity Unit. And it was at 1, 3, and 6 weeks. Of course, the interest of the ocean surface resides, it's in immediate effect. But I will go back to that. Next slide. So what you can see after 1 week, you see the bone implant contact are those different implants. Astra, Nobel, and Straumann, you have about 20% bone implant contact after 1 week. With the ocean surface, you have 30%. This is 50% more bone after the first week. So this is significant. It clearly shows that when you place this implant in the bone, it's going to create bone. It's going to create new bone. Next slide. Now, we have seen what was going on about the surface. Let's go back now. Let's zoom away from the surface. Next slide. So this is from the same study. What you can see here after 1 week, the Astra and the Straumann. On the left, it's close to the collar, and on the right is more into the body of the implant. Those implants, they have a compressive design. The osteotomy is much smaller than the implant. So basically, you have a feeling of good stability, but this is fake, because what will happen, you have a lot of micro cracks. Those are those black lines, because you put a lot of torque into the bone, you are going to crack the bone everywhere, and you're going to pay the bill because the bone is going to resorb, is going to remodel, is going to reform. Next slide. On the Intralock Blossom design, the healing process is very different. The osteotomy is usually bigger, so we create bone chambers. You see the osteotomy site. After 1 week, as we have seen, the bone formation is very fast. So you see already the woven bone forming in the gap. Next slide. At 3 weeks, what I just mentioned happened. On Astra and Straumann, you see the bone resorbing, which is the result of the compression. And on the non-cortical, you see the new bone forming. Next slide. On the Intralock, you see the new bone, which is calcifying pretty fast. Next slide. At 6 weeks, you see the bone that has resorbed is now reforming. Next slide. And on the Intralock, you see on the ocean surface, everywhere, it's filled with bone. Next slide. Next slide again. Now we move further back. We zoom back, we're going to look at the implant design from a millimetric perspective. That's the Blossom thread. Next slide. And this is very interesting. Next slide. Because I'm going to be very short because we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to summarize it. In all the different implant design you have available on the market, basically what they call self-tapping implants is just a bone tap at the apex of the implant. But as a clinician, I have observed very early that was not a very good design, because this bone tap 90-degree cutting like you will find in the hardware store is effective, but when it becomes clogged, that's not effective again, and you have a lot of compression. And I understood also a long time ago that when you place an implant with a high torque is not good, because the bone doesn't like high torque. You're going to have bone resorption and remodeling around the implant. So you want to place the implant in a very gentle way. You want to be able to place an implant that is stable, but not with a lot of torque, which would be too much compression. Next slide. So I don't want to spend too much time on history. Next slide. You know, basically that's what it is. It's a quasi-absence of history design that have been designed specifically for dental implants. If you look at dental implants around the world, they just look like, you know, basic engineering of screws, and they look like screws from the hardware. Next slide. Next slide. So this is a classic tap implant, could be any brand. So you see, when you turn, you cut through the bone and you collect the particles. Next slide. We wanted to create a design that cuts to the bone, but that doesn't clog into the tapping design. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So we want to cut through the bone with no trauma and with no excessive compression. Next slide. Okay. Continue. So we want to lower the insertion torque, but as I will show you, lowering the insertion torque will not lower the primary stability. Quite the opposite. Next slide. Next slide. Just finesse. Next slide. Like knife. The regular tap design will work like this. A lot of pressure. Next slide. A lot of time. Let's. So this is the blossom design. You see, it's like a very sharp blade, 3 sharp blades on every thread. Because when you look at it from the apex, it looks like a blossom. Next. Next. Those are big. So that's how it cuts into the bone. You see, when it cuts into the bone, it harvests small particles of bone, but all over the implant surface, not only in the tap area. Next slide. This is a close-up. Next slide. So this is a study that has been published also from the same group, NYU, and my good friend Stefan Bonfante from Brazil. Next slide. And it shows basically the same implant, but the first one with no tap at all, the one with the classic tap design, which was our implant for many years before the Blossom, and the third one with the Blossom. So you see the insertion torque. Of course, with no cutting thread, it goes to the roof. With the standard self-tapping implant, it cuts in half. And with the Blossom, it cuts in half again. So it's 25% of the original. Next slide. What about stability? Because insertion torque, it's something, but how to measure stability? Next slide. Measure stability from an engineering. You apply force at 90 degrees to the implant and you measure the micro movement. You cannot do that in the mouth, but you can do that in vitro. That we did. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. One more. So this is the device that we fabricated. So you have a dynamometer which apply forces. It will apply force to the implant, to the abutment on the implant, and on the other side you have a micrometer that will measure displacement. Next slide. This is a close-up, and it measures up to the micrometer. Next slide. That's another close-up. Next slide. And let's look at the results now. Next slide. Okay, now it becomes interesting. As you can see, the implant on the left with the highest, with no flutes, no cutting flutes, actually is the one with the biggest micromobility. And the one with the Blossom, which had the lowest insertion torque, is the one with the best primary stability. So we were scratching our head for a moment in order to explain that, but actually it's not difficult to understand. It's very simple. It's because when you increase the torque to such high value, basically you mess up the bone. The bone is going to be like a puree of bone, and the implant is going to move within its osteotomy. When you have a clean cut, like the Blossom cut, you cut just like a sword into fresh bone, and you anchor your implant into fresh bone, and it's moving nowhere. Next slide. So the next step was to validate this with a clinical study. That's what we did. Next slide. And this is very important. Could you go back one? Higher insertion torque is not actually it's like a Gauss curve. It goes together. Primary stability goes together with insertion torque, but if you increase a certain number, then torque continues to increase, but primary stability goes down. Next one. Next one. Next one again. So side, the classic tap on the left on the implant motor, and the Blossom cut on the right. So very soon this will stop because the implant motor has a torque limitation of like 50 or 60 Newton centimeters. So it will stop. On the Blossom, it will go all the way down because it will never reach this limiting value. Next. The study. Next slide. So the insertion torque, we already know that. Next slide. And this is the bone healing after 3 weeks. This is the classic tap design. So you see those microfractures. They are the black lines. Next slide. So this is the regular implant with the regular tap. So you see those zones of high compression, they have to resolve. Next slide. And after 6 weeks, it eventually heals. Let's compare now with the Blossom design. Next slide. So you see after 3 weeks, it's a totally different picture. You see almost zero microfracture, and you see a lot of bone, and you see I talked about the micro-harvesting of the bone. Next slide. You will see after 6 weeks that those little things, they were the little particles of bones that were harvested when cutting into the bone, and they serve as some initial points of bone formation. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So I will not go any further because I can show you so many things, like clinical slides, but we have a lot of colleagues with a lot of clinical data. So I will limit myself to this for the moment, and I will take your questions at the end of the session. Thank you very much for your attention.
You told you but in 6 weeks or 8 weeks.
As Miller
Give forces. So thread consider traction with digital and immediate placement on full torch. So it's been you don't need to work. You don't need to wait because now it's Blossom, also in surface, but it's also multiple implants. So you have a mechanical splint, which reduces even more the risk of micromovement. But if you add to that priming the implant with the PL, I cannot do that because there are too many factors. Many cases of
just another comment to that. My lecture will show how you partially answer your question.
Is there any country who are immunely compromised? Is there any
I've never come across anything using PRF. It's hard to imagine a reason not to use it. And it's better because it's concentrated growth factor. So we use it in patients who are anticoagulated. We use it in patients who have other medical problems. And it accentuates and accelerates healing in all of those cases without any contraindications.
Great, thank you.
For both, anybody can answer. Thank you for your lecture and your ideas. You know, as a clinician, like you, working since almost 30 years, it gave us now a new challenge. Less insertion torque, more primary stability. I know that the insertion torque, when you put it on your motor, it's depend on the manufacturer advice. Some implant system will tell you put 40, some put 20. Now, the under preparation of the osteotomy, the normal size of the osteotomy with your drill, with the diameter of the implant. We have our feeling. We need to know if the bone is less compact, more compact. So, you confuse me now.
See if I can give you a little bit of clarity on that. There's three terms I want you to understand. Primary stability is one of three. It starts with initial stability, which is within the first 48 hours, the resistance to displacement of an implant, and that's directly related to the amount of microfracture that exists upon placement of your implant, and that is directly related to insertion torque. Primary stability is the catabolic remodeling phase, which occurs over the first 4 weeks, and that remodeling phase is also going to be directly proportional to the amount of microfractured bone. So if you have a device on your implant that has smaller, more discrete, and spaced micrografts, you'll get better primary stability because you won't have an exaggerated remodeling effect. Secondary stability is anabolic bone growth, which is after 4 weeks. So in all cases, I have found that not only am I getting better healing early, I'm going to show you radiographically why we are actually loading our implants early, anywhere from 4 to 6 or 8 weeks in single tooth. But we have to be able to confirm that. There are devices that you can use, such as Ostel, but Ostel just gives you percentage of bone to implant contact. It does not talk about the maturity of bone. But I'm talking about radiographic evidence of maturity of bone. And I think that will answer both of the questions that you posed.
I agree. You told us the definition. From a clinical point of view, let's take the end goals. When you have a failure, you go back to your, if you still remember, or if you write your note exactly in the file, you will be able to know if you did an over preparation, an under preparation, if you use the machine drive torque, and then in the middle of the way